The air tasted of nothing. It was a manufactured, sterile void, scrubbed of dust and pollen and life, leaving only the faint, metallic tang of recycled oxygen and the ever-present hum of the filtration systems that were the sanctuary's lungs. Subject 734, known in the silent, forgotten archives of his own mind as Elian, breathed it in. It did not fill him. It only occupied space. He sat on the edge of the integrated sleep platform, his back straight, his hands resting on his knees, palms up, in the precise posture of compliance dictated by the morning chimes. The floor beneath his bare feet was a seamless polymer, cool and unforgiving. It knew no warmth. The walls were the same, glowing with a soft, sourceless light that had no dawn and no dusk, only a perpetual, shadowless noon. There were no windows. A window was a vulnerability, a breach in the perfect, hermetic seal of his world. He was not a person. He was a specimen. He was a valuable, delicate asset housed in a sterile vitrine, and the world outside was a contagion. This was the first truth taught to him, a lesson etched not in books, but in the very architecture of his existence. He traced a line on his gray tunic, the fabric smooth and synthetic. The motion was slow, a secret rebellion, a deviation from perfect stillness. His gaze drifted to the mirrored panel on the far wall. It wasn't a true mirror, not glass and silver, but a biometric scanner that reflected a distorted, data-overlaid version of himself. It showed his vitals in pale blue script floating beside his temple. Heart rate stable, respiration normal, core temperature optimal. It showed his hormone levels, the suppressants working with clinical efficiency, a flat line where a turbulent ocean should be. The Omega within him was a ghost, a whisper in a locked room. He looked at the face in the reflection. Pale skin, dark hair cropped to regulation length, eyes the color of a storm-clouded sea. They were blank. He had practiced the blankness, cultivated it as a shield. Emotion was a symptom, a malfunction to be corrected with sedatives and recalibration sessions. He had learned that lesson early, the sting of the neural pacifier, a sharp electric memory, the scent of ozone, the brief, terrifying darkness. He was not an experiment. He was a success story. The sanctuary had taken him in, a traumatized, scent-uncontrolled child, and had molded him into this. A perfect, placid creature. Stable, predictable, safe. The words were a mantra drilled into him by the soft, synthesized voice that governed his days. Safety, order, serenity. He felt none of them. Beneath the placid surface, beneath the chemical dampening, something coiled and waited. It was a memory of a different air, thick with the smell of rain on dry earth and the sweet, cloying scent of night-blooming jasmine. A memory of a hand, calloused and warm, holding his. A memory of a scream, sharp and sudden, that tore the night apart. The memories were glitches in his conditioning, fragments of a corrupted file the technicians could never fully erase. They came to him in the gray hours before the waking chimes, leaving a residue of longing so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. A longing for what? He did not have the words for it. Freedom was an abstract concept from a history data file, a chaotic, dangerous state that led to suffering. And yet the ghost inside him yearned for it. It was a primal biological imperative, more powerful than any chemical suppressor. A chime, soft and melodic, echoed through the chamber. Mealtime. He rose, his movements fluid and economical, and walked to the aperture in the wall. A tray slid out, holding a nutrient paste, a vitamin supplement, and a glass of purified water. It tasted of nothing, just like the air. He ate without appetite, his gaze fixed on the biometric panel. He watched the numbers beside his head, the cold, hard data of his own existence. He was a closed system, a perfectly balanced equation. But sometimes, in the dead of the facility's artificial night, he would press his palm against the cool wall and feel for a vibration, a tremor, anything to prove that there was a world beyond this white, silent tomb. He would close his eyes and try to summon the scent of rain. It was an act of defiance. It was an act of hope. And in a world designed to extinguish both, it was the only thing that made him feel real. He finished the paste and placed the tray back in the aperture. It retracted with a soft hiss. His day would proceed as scheduled. Physical conditioning, educational modules, sensory evaluation. Each moment was preordained, a line of code in an endless program. But today, the hum of the facility felt different. A lower, more resonant frequency vibrated through the floor, a subtle shift in the machine's heartbeat. It was a dissonance in the perfect, sterile symphony of his life. Something was coming. The blankness in his eyes flickered, and for a single unguarded moment the reflection in the panel showed not a placid subject but a caged animal. And it was terrified. The air pressure shifted, a subtle, almost imperceptible change, but to senses honed by a lifetime of sterile monotony, it was a thunderclap. It was the whisper of an alien atmosphere entering his sealed world. Elian froze in the middle of his conditioning exercises, his body locked in a balanced, muscular pose. The synthesized voice continued its placid instruction, but he no longer heard it. The new vibration in the floor intensified, the low thrum of heavy, purposeful footsteps echoing from the corridor beyond his chamber door. It was not the soft-souled shuffle of the beta technicians or the rhythmic patrol of the automated sentinels. This was the sound of authority, the sound of power. He lowered his arms slowly, every nerve ending screaming. His heart rate, so long held in check by chemical leashes, began to climb. He saw the numbers tick upward on the biometric panel. 72, 75, 81. A warning light would flash soon. He needed to calm himself. He needed to breathe. But the air tasted different now. It was still clean, still sterile, but it carried a ghost of something else. Something sharp and cold, like ozone after a lightning strike, with an undercurrent of something darker, richer, something alpha. A primal fear, deep and instinctual, seized him. It bypassed his conditioning, his years of practiced placidity. This was the fear from the corrupted files, the terror of the torn night, the scent of the predator. His chamber door, a seamless panel in the wall, hissed open. He did not turn. He kept his eyes fixed on his own wavering reflection, watching the stranger's arrival in the mirrored surface. Two guards in immaculate gray uniforms, their faces obscured by polarized helmets, entered first. They took up positions on either side of the doorway, their stun batons held at a ready formal angle. They were static, part of the architecture. Then he entered. The man was tall, his frame outlined by the severe, tailored lines of a commander's uniform, the fabric a stark, unforgiving black against the chamber's pervasive white. The insignia on his collar glittered under the flat light. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of absolute control, his polished boots making no sound on the polymer floor. He was the source of the scent, the epicenter of the disturbance. It wasn't the unrestrained feral musk of the alphas in the warning modules. This was a scent leashed, disciplined, almost frozen. It was the scent of cold steel and winter air, of absolute, unshakable authority. Commander Valerius. The name surfaced from a recent briefing file downloaded into Elian's mind while he slept. The new sector commander, an architect of the Consortium Stability Initiative, a man known for his clinical efficiency and unwavering belief in the system that owned Elian. Valerius stopped in the center of the room. He did not look at Elian directly. Instead, his gaze swept over the chamber, assessing its sterility, its perfect order. His eyes, a pale, piercing gray, were like chips of ice. They held no warmth, no malice, only a profound, unsettling stillness. He was observing the cage before inspecting the specimen. A beta technician, a familiar woman named Lyra with kind but perpetually nervous eyes, scurried in behind him, clutching a datapad. "Commander," she stammered, her voice thin in the heavy silence. "Subject 734. As you requested, he is our most stable Omega, a testament to the sanctuary's success." Valerius gave a short, dismissive nod, his eyes finally settling on Elian's reflection in the biometric panel. He studied the floating data, the rising heart rate, the subtle tremor in the line of Elian's shoulders. He was reading Elian not as a person, but as a report. "Stable," Valerius repeated, the word flat, devoid of inflection. His voice was a low baritone, as controlled as his scent. "His cortisol levels are elevated," Lyra paled. "A momentary anomaly, Commander. The subject's conditioning is impeccable. He will regulate." "Let me be the judge of that." Valerius took a step forward. Elian's muscles tensed. Every instinct screamed at him to run, to hide, to make himself small. But there was nowhere to run. There was only the white room and the black-clad predator at its center. He forced himself to remain still, to breathe, to push the fear down into the chemically induced quiet. He had to be the success story. He had to be stable. His survival depended on it. Valerius circled him slowly, like a hawk studying its prey. The proximity was agonizing. The disciplined scent of the alpha was a physical pressure against Elian's skin, a static charge that made the fine hairs on his arms stand on end. It was not aggressive, yet it was overwhelmingly dominant. It was the scent of a will that had never been broken, of a power that had never been questioned. The commander stopped in front of him, his shadow falling over Elian. For the first time, Elian lifted his head, breaking the posture of compliance, and met the man's gaze directly. It was a risk, a flagrant act of defiance. He expected anger, a reprimand, the cold fury of a superior being challenged. He saw none of that. In the commander's pale gray eyes, he saw a flicker of something else. Not interest, not curiosity. It was recognition. A clinical acknowledgement of the fire he was trying so hard to hide. Valerius looked at him, truly looked at him for a long, silent moment. The air crackled with unspoken tension. He saw past the blank expression, past the perfect posture. He saw the cage thing. Then the commander turned to the trembling technician. "The others I was shown were placid, docile. They were complete." He paused, his gaze returning to Elian. "This one is not. He is merely contained. There is a flaw in his conditioning." Lyra opened her mouth to defend her work, to defend her subject, but Valerius raised a single gloved hand. The motion was slight, but it silenced her instantly. "The flaw is what makes him valuable, the commander stated, his voice a cold, final judgment. He looked directly at Elian, the words aimed at him like a weapon. "Prepare him for transfer to my quarters. I am requisitioning this asset." The word hung in the air, asset. A tool, a piece of property. Elian felt the floor drop out from under him. The other Omegas, the docile ones, were assigned to distant, faceless alphas for political pairings, sent away from the sanctuary forever. But this was different. To be taken by the commander himself, to be kept here, under his direct control, in his personal space, it was a sentence he could not comprehend. It was a cage within a cage. He saw Lyra's eyes widen in shock, and behind that, a flicker of pity. She knew what this meant. He was no longer just a subject. He was the commander's personal experiment. The carefully constructed walls of his composure finally crumbled. His breath hitched, a small, desperate sound in the sudden ringing silence. He lowered his eyes, his body trembling, the data on the panel behind him flashing a frantic crimson red. He was not a success story. He was a failure, and his punishment was just beginning. The transfer was swift and silent, a clinical procedure devoid of emotion. Elian was flanked by the two helmeted guards, his movements stiff, his gaze fixed on the seamless gray floor of the corridor. He walked through halls he had never seen, past doors that remained perpetually sealed. The sanctuary was larger than he had ever imagined, a labyrinth of white and gray. Each step took him further from the known, regulated misery of his own chamber and deeper into the commander's sphere of influence. He could feel it in the air. The faint, controlled scent of the Alpha was embedded in the very walls of this sector, a subtle declaration of territory. His new cage was not a cell. It was a suite of rooms, opulent by sanctuary standards. The main chamber was vast, furnished with a low black sofa and a desk of polished chrome. One entire wall was a sheet of reinforced glass, not a window to the outside world, but an observation pane looking out over the central nexus of the sanctuary. A sterile, multi-leveled atrium buzzing with the quiet, purposeful movements of technicians and automated drones. It was the view from the spider's web. The adjoining room held a sleeping platform larger than his own and a personal sanitation unit. The light was softer here, adjustable. The air was still filtered, but it lacked the harsh, antiseptic bite of the lower levels. It was a gilded cage, but the bars were no less real. He was left alone. The door slid shut with a soft, definitive click, the sound of a lock engaging. He stood in the center of the room for a long time, a statue of gray in a world of black and white. He was waiting for a command, an instruction. His entire life had been governed by chimes and synthesized voices. The silence was a new form of torment. It was a void he did not know how to fill. He explored the space with hesitant steps, his bare feet sinking slightly into a dark gray rug. The texture was a shock after a lifetime of unyielding polymer. He ran his fingers over the cool surface of the chrome desk, touched the synthetic fabric of the sofa. These were new sensations, new data points, for a mind starved of stimulus. But they brought no comfort. They were just more sophisticated elements of his confinement. Hours passed. The light in the atrium outside the great window shifted from the bright white of the primary cycle to the muted blue of the rest cycle. Still, the commander did not appear. Elian did not eat the meal that appeared in the wall aperture. He did not sleep. He sat on the floor, his back pressed against the cold glass, and watched the silent, ceaseless activity of the sanctuary. He was watching the machine that had built him. He was a product, an asset. The words echoed in his mind. He was not chosen for his stability, but for his flaw. The commander had seen the cracks in his conditioning, and instead of ordering him recalibrated, had decided to study them up close. What did he want? What was this experiment? The door hissed open. Elian's head snapped up, his body instantly rigid. Commander Valerius entered, having removed the formal jacket of his uniform. He wore a simple black tunic that did little to soften the severe lines of his form. He moved into the room without looking at Elian, his focus on a data pad in his hand. He sat at the chrome desk, his back to the Omega, and the silence stretched once more, thick and heavy with his presence. Elian's heart hammered against his ribs. He was an object in the room, a piece of furniture the commander had acquired. He was meant to be still, silent, and unobtrusive. He forced himself to regulate his breathing, to push down the panic. He tried to make himself smaller, to fade into the shadows at the edge of the room. The nutrient paste is specifically formulated for your dietary needs, Valerius said, his voice calm, detached. He did not turn around. Refusing it will trigger a malnutrition alert in the medical logs. They will send a technician to administer it intravenously. I would prefer to avoid the paperwork. The statement was not a threat. It was a simple, logical progression of events. A statement of fact. Eat, or the system will force you to eat. There is no other option. Slowly, Stiffly, Elian rose. He went to the aperture, took the untouched tray, and sat on the floor. He dipped the spoon into the cold, gray paste and brought it to his lips. It tasted the same as always. It tasted of nothing. He ate under the commander's unseen gaze, each swallow a surrender. When he was finished, he returned the tray. He waited. "There is a sonic cleanser in the sanitation unit," Valerius continued, still focused on his datapad. "The sleep platform is calibrated to your biometric signature. You will rest." Another command disguised as information. There was no room for disobedience. The system was absolute. Elian retreated to the adjoining room, the partition sliding shut behind him. The privacy was a small, almost insignificant mercy. He stood before the cleanser unit, its low hum vibrating through his feet. He stripped off his gray tunic and leggings, the uniform of a subject, and let the sonic waves wash over his skin. He felt unclean, as if the Alpha's scent had soaked into him, marking him in a way the machine could not erase. He lay on the sleep platform, the surface molding perfectly to his body. It was soft, a luxury he had never known, but sleep would not come. He could feel the commander's presence through the wall, a silent, powerful weight. He was sleeping in the predator's den. He was the prey, brought back alive for some unknown purpose. He closed his eyes and saw not the sterile white of his old life, but the piercing, ice-gray eyes of the commander. He saw the flicker of recognition, the clinical assessment of his soul. He was not an asset. The commander had said it himself. He was a flaw, a problem to be studied, a puzzle to be solved. And as he lay there in the luxurious, silent darkness, a terrifying thought took root in his mind. What happens when the puzzle is solved? What happens when the experiment is over? The question followed him into a thin, restless sleep, haunted by the scent of cold steel and the memory of a scream. The days bled into one another, each a seamless continuation of the last, marked only by the shifting light in the atrium beyond the glass. A routine began to form, not of chimes and synthesized voices, but of the commander's silent, oppressive presence. Valerius was a creature of absolute discipline. He rose before the primary cycle began, worked at his desk for hours without pause, and consumed his meals with the same detached efficiency with which he reviewed security protocols. He rarely spoke to Elian. His acknowledgments were brief nods, his instructions concise and impersonal. Yet his gaze was a constant weight. Elian felt it when he was performing his conditioning exercises, when he was reading from the datapad provided to him, even when he tried to lose himself in the silent ballet of the drones in the atrium. The commander was always watching, always analyzing. Elian's resistance became a silent internal war. He followed every instruction to the letter, his movements precise, his expression placid. He made his body a fortress of compliance, while inside his mind screamed. He refused the small comforts of his new cage. He slept on the floor beside the perfectly calibrated platform. He ignored the expanded library of data files, choosing instead to reread the same dry technical manuals he'd been assigned in his cell. He would give the commander nothing. He would not be a puzzle. He would be a blank page. One evening, as Elian sat staring at a schematic of a filtration system, Valerius spoke, breaking a silence that had lasted for over 16 hours. The archives contain more than engineering texts, 734. Elian did not look up. This content is sufficient for my educational requirements. Your requirements are whatever I dictate them to be, Valerius stated, his voice even. There is a collection of pre-consortium literature, poetry, philosophy. You may find it inefficient, but it provides context for the emotional volatility that plagued our ancestors. He was testing him, baiting him, trying to find the flaw. Elian kept his eyes on the schematic. I have no interest in emotional volatility, Commander. A flicker of something that might have been amusement crossed Valerius's face. It was a minute tightening at the corner of his mouth, gone as quickly as it appeared. "Of course not. You are a stable asset." The word was deployed with surgical precision, a reminder of his status. But the irony was not lost on Elian. The commander knew he was anything but stable. He was a bomb, and Valerius was tapping the casing, listening for the tick. Another day, Valerius left a small, smooth, dark stone on the edge of the chrome desk. It was an anomaly in the sterile environment, an object of organic, imperfect origin. It was a river stone, worn smooth by centuries of water. Elian knew this from a geology file. He stared at it for hours. It was a piece of the outside, a piece of the world he was denied. His hand twitched with the urge to touch it, to feel its texture, its coolness, its weight. It was a profound, desperate longing. But he did not touch it. To show interest would be to reveal a crack in his armor. The stone remained on the desk, a silent accusation. The experiment continued. Valerius would sometimes speak of the world beyond the sanctuary, not to Elian directly, but as if dictating notes to himself. He spoke of star charts and orbital mechanics, of the rust-colored deserts of Mars and the methane seas of Titan. He painted pictures of a universe vast and cold and beautiful, a universe Elian could only access through data files. He was opening doors in Elian's mind, showing him the sheer scale of his own confinement. It was a sophisticated form of cruelty. One night the nightmares returned. Not the usual vague sense of dread, but the fragmented, terrifyingly vivid memories. The scent of rain, sharp and clean, the cloying sweetness of jasmine, the texture of rough bark against his cheek as he hid behind a tree, then the other scent, the feral, aggressive musk of an uncontrolled alpha thick with rage, the sound of splintering wood, a woman's scream, his mother's, a man's shout of defiance, his father's. Then silence, a profound, ringing silence, broken only by his own ragged, terrified breaths. He woke up with a strangled gasp, his body drenched in cold sweat, the phantom scent of blood in his nostrils. He was curled on the floor, trembling violently. The partition to his room slid open. Valerius stood in the doorway, a tall, dark silhouette against the muted light of the main chamber. Elian flinched, scrambling backward until his back hit the wall. He was exposed, his terror laid bare. The flaw was showing. The commander did not move. He simply watched, his expression unreadable in the dim light. Elian expected a reprimand for the disturbance, a call to the medics for a sedative. "A memory corruption," Valerius stated. It was not a question. "They are a known side effect of early-stage trauma conditioning." He knew, of course he knew. He had read Elian's file. He knew every broken piece of him. "The official report is sparse," Valerius continued, his voice a low murmur, almost conversational. "A feral alpha attack on an outlying settlement. You were the only survivor, found in a state of shock, your own scent glands prematurely activated by the trauma." Elian squeezed his eyes shut, pressing his palms against them as if he could physically block out the images. He didn't want to hear this. He didn't want to remember. "The sanctuary saved you," Valerius said, the words echoing the official doctrine. "It gave you order. It gave you safety." "It put me in a cage," Elian choked out, the words raw, torn from his throat. It was the first time he had spoken to the commander of his own volition, the first time he had given voice to the truth of his existence. A long silence followed. Elian braced himself for the consequences of his insubordination, the sting of a pacifier, the cold fog of recalibration. Instead, he heard the soft hiss of the partition closing. Valerius had left him alone, alone with the ghosts, and with the terrifying, liberating echo of his own defiant words. He was not just a flaw, he was a rebel, and the commander had heard him. The act of speaking his truth, Of voicing his defiance had changed something fundamental in the atmosphere between them. The silence was no longer empty. It was charged with the memory of his words. Valerius did not mention the incident. The next day proceeded with its usual sterile routine, but Elian could feel a shift in the commander's observation. The clinical detachment was still there, but it was now threaded with something else, a focused intensity that made Elian's skin crawl. He felt less like a specimen in a jar and more like a complex equation the commander was determined to solve. The river stone was still on the desk. One afternoon, while Valerius was occupied with a series of encrypted communiques, Elian's gaze fell upon it. The urge to touch it, to connect with that small piece of an organic world, was overwhelming. His conditioning warred with his instinct. To show desire was to show weakness. To reveal a longing was to give the commander a key to his mind. But the stone represented everything he had lost, everything he secretly craved. With a trembling hand he reached out and picked it up. The sensation was electric. It was cool, smooth, and solid in his palm, a grounding weight of reality in his artificial world. He closed his fingers around it, the texture of forbidden pleasure. He had forgotten the feeling of anything not man-made. A shadow fell over him. He looked up, his heart seizing in his chest. Valerius was standing over him, his face impassive, his gray eyes fixed on Elian's clenched fist. Elian expected the order to drop it. He expected a lecture on contraband or unsanctioned sensory stimulus. "It is basalt," Valerius said, his voice quiet, "from the riverbeds of Boreas Prime. The water there runs so cold it can freeze skin in seconds." Elian stared at him, confused. This was not a reprimand. It was information, a shared secret. "The report stated you were found near a river," Valerius continued, his gaze unwavering. "Do you remember the water?" Elian's throat was tight. He shook his head, the lie automatic. He remembered the cold mud, the sharp reeds, the terrifying rush of the current as he hid. "A shame," Valerius said, a strange, almost wistful note in his voice. "It is a powerful element, unpredictable, uncontainable." He looked from the stone in Elian's hand to Elian's face, and for a fleeting moment the commander's mask of control slipped. Elian saw a flicker of something ancient and weary in his eyes, a deep-seated frustration that seemed directed not at Elian, but at the sterile world around them, at the system he so perfectly embodied. The moment passed. Valerius turned and walked back to his desk, leaving Elian with the stone in his hand and a maelstrom of confusion in his mind. The commander was not just studying his flaw, he was nurturing it. He was watering a seed of rebellion he himself had identified. Why? What was his purpose? Was this a more sophisticated method of breaking him, of forcing a confession of his deepest desires only to use them against him? The paranoia was a familiar cloak, but it felt thin now. The commander's actions were a paradox. He was the architect of the cage, yet he kept smuggling in whispers of the world outside its bars. The pressure was building inside Elian, the constant surveillance, the psychological games, the resurfacing of his trauma. It was all wearing down his defenses. The chemical suppressants that kept his Omega nature dormant felt less effective each day. He could feel faint, phantom echoes of sensation, a heightened sense of smell, a sensitivity to the emotional currents in the room, a deep cellular ache of loneliness. The ghost in the locked room was beginning to rattle the door. He knew he could not survive this indefinitely. He was not a stone to be worn down over centuries. He was a living being, and his spirit was eroding. The thought of escape, once an abstract, impossible dream, began to solidify into a desperate, frantic need. It was illogical. It was suicide. The sanctuary was a fortress, and Valerius was its master. But the alternative, to stay here and be slowly, methodically dissected until nothing was left of him, was a death of a different kind. He began to watch, not the drones in the atrium, but the flow of personnel, the timing of the guard patrols he could see through the glass, the schematics of the ventilation systems he had memorized. He started searching for a flaw not in himself, but in the perfect, sterile machine around him. He had to get out. He would rather die in a desperate bid for freedom than slowly suffocate in this gilded cage. The escape was not a plan. It was an impulse, a raw, desperate surge of instinct that overrode all logic and conditioning. It happened during a shift change, a brief 30-second window where the patrol routes in the central atrium overlapped, creating a momentary blind spot near a service conduit. Elian had observed it for 3 cycles, a tiny imperfection in the system's otherwise flawless choreography. Valerius was in the sanitation unit, the low hum of the sonic cleanser a cover for Elian's frantic movements. He had no tools, no weapons, only the desperate strength of a cornered animal. The main door to the suite was biometrically sealed, but the food aperture was a potential weakness. He had spent hours studying its mechanism, a simple magnetic lock designed to prevent tampering from the outside, not the inside. He jammed the edge of his nutrient tray into the seam, prying with all his might. The metal groaned, sweat beaded on his forehead, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened. Then with a sharp crack, the lock gave way. The opening was small, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through. He scrambled into the service corridor behind the wall, a space of exposed wiring and humming conduits, thick with the smell of ozone and hot metal. It was dark, claustrophobic. He was inside the machine's guts. He ran, his bare feet slapping against the metal grating, following the path he had memorized from the schematics. The air was hot and tasted of dust. It was the first real scent he had smelled in years, and it was glorious. It was the scent of imperfection, of reality. He reached the ventilation shaft he had identified. The cover was held by 4 simple bolts. He used the bent edge of the tray, his fingers raw and bleeding as he worked the screws. One gave way, then another. The sound of an alarm, faint at first, then growing louder, echoed through the conduits. They knew, Valerius knew. He worked faster, his breath coming in ragged sobs. The 3rd bolt came loose. The alarm was screaming now, a piercing, rhythmic shriek. Red emergency lights began to flash, casting the narrow corridor in a hellish, strobing glare. The last bolt. It wouldn't budge. It was stripped, frozen. Panic, cold and absolute, seized him. He pulled at the grate with his bleeding fingers, a wild, despairing cry tearing from his throat. The grate held fast. Footsteps, heavy running footsteps, echoing from the direction he had come. They were coming for him. The guards would have stun batons. They would drag him back. He would be sedated, recalibrated, his mind wiped clean of this brief, failed rebellion. He would be returned to a state of perfect, living death. He slumped against the wall, his body trembling, defeated. The footsteps grew closer, slowing to a halt just around the bend in the corridor. It was not the sound of a squad of guards. It was a single person. Valerius. The commander appeared, his black uniform a void in the flashing red light. He was not angry. His face was a mask of cold, unreadable calm. His pale gray eyes held a strange, almost disappointed light. He looked at Elian's trembling form, at his bleeding hands, at the hopelessly jammed grate. "Did you truly believe this would succeed?" Valerius asked, his voice dangerously quiet over the scream of the alarm. "Did you think the architects of this facility were so incompetent?" Elian pushed himself away from the wall, his back scraping against a bundle of cables. "Let me go," he whispered, the words a desperate, hopeless plea. He was begging his jailer for the key. Valerius took a slow step forward, his shadow engulfing Elian. "Go where? To the outside you barely remember? You are a conditioned creature, 734. You wouldn't survive a day. You are an Omega, Unbonded and sent uncontrolled, the world you dream of would tear you apart. It's better than this, Elian spat, a surge of defiance cutting through his fear. Better to be torn apart than to be your specimen. He scrambled to his feet, trying to back away, but there was nowhere to go. He was trapped between the unyielding wall and the unyielding man. "Please!" he begged, the defiance crumbling back into desperation. His voice broke. "I'm begging you. Just let me go." Valerius reached him in a single, swift stride. Elian flinched, raising his hands to shield himself, expecting a blow, the sharp sting of a weapon. But Valerius didn't strike him. He grabbed Elian's arm, his grip like steel, and pulled him forward. Elian struggled, a wild, panicked thrashing, but it was useless. The commander's strength was absolute. He pulled Elian flush against his chest, one arm wrapping around his back, holding him fast. The proximity was a shock to the system, a sensory overload. The crisp, cold scent of the Alpha, amplified by the close contact, filled his lungs, drowning out the ozone and dust. It was terrifyingly intimate. Elian's struggles ceased. He was frozen, his face pressed against the rough fabric of the commander's tunic. He could feel the steady, controlled beat of the man's heart against his cheek. He could feel the solid wall of muscle beneath the cloth. "I cannot," Valerius murmured, his voice a low vibration that resonated through Elian's entire body. The alarm suddenly cut out, plunging the corridor into a heavy, ringing silence, broken only by the hum of the conduits and Elian's ragged breathing. The red lights continued their silent, rhythmic flashing, painting the scene in pulses of crimson and black. "To them," Valerius continued, his voice close to Elian's ear, a cold, soft whisper, "you are a malfunctioning asset. They will have you decommissioned or recalibrated until the flaw, the part of you that is still human, is erased." He paused and his grip tightened, not with anger, but with a strange, fierce possessiveness. He pulled Elian even closer, a gesture that was both a capture and a shield. "But to me," the commander's voice was strained, as if the words were being forced from a place of deep, unfamiliar conflict. "To me, you are a variable I cannot yet solve, and I do not relinquish my experiments." He was not an asset. He was not a person. He was a problem, a puzzle, and the commander, the ultimate solver of problems, would not let him go. Elian hung limp in his arms, the fight draining out of him, replaced by a cold, hollow despair. He had begged for freedom, and in response, his cage had just contracted to the size of his jailer's embrace. The walk back to the suite was a blur of shame and defeat. Valerius did not drag him. He maintained a firm grip on Elian's upper arm, his presence a silent, immovable wall at his side. The guards they passed in the corridor averted their eyes, their bodies rigid with a deference that was now tinged with fear. The commander's displeasure was a palpable force. The alarm had been silenced, the flashing lights extinguished, but the incident had left a scar on the facility's sterile perfection. Back in the suite, the door hissed shut, sealing them in. Valerius released him. Elian stumbled away, wrapping his arms around himself, his bleeding hands leaving faint red smears on his gray tunic. He refused to look at the commander, fixing his gaze on the floor. He waited for the verdict, for the punishment. "Show me your hands," Valerius commanded. The tone was flat, clinical. Elian hesitated, then slowly, reluctantly, held them out. They were a mess of scrapes and broken nails, the skin raw and angry. Valerius retrieved a medical kit from a wall compartment. He motioned for Elian to sit on the edge of the sleep platform in the main room. Elian obeyed, his body moving with the sluggishness of a machine powering down. He sat rigid and trembling as the commander knelt before him. Valerius took one of his hands. His touch was unexpectedly gentle. His gloved fingers were deft and precise as he cleaned the wounds with an antiseptic wipe. The sting was sharp, but Elian did not flinch. He was numb, disconnected from the physical sensation. He watched, detached, as the commander applied a thin layer of biosynthetic skin, the gel cool and soothing. "You were careless," Valerius said, his eyes focused on his task. "Your plan had a 97.4% probability of failure. The remaining 2.6% involved you being incapacitated or killed in the ventilation system. There was no scenario that ended in your freedom." Elian remained silent. The words were true. His escape attempt had been nothing more than a desperate suicidal gesture. It had been an act of emotion, not logic. "Emotion is a liability," Valerius continued, as if reading his thoughts. He finished with the first hand and moved to the second. "It creates chaos. It compromises strategy. The consortium, the sanctuary, this entire system is designed to eliminate that variable, to create a society of perfect logical order." "A society of cages," Elian whispered, the words barely audible. Valerius paused. He lifted his gaze, his pale gray eyes meeting Elian's. For the first time, Elian saw not a commander, not a jailer, but a man, and that man was wrestling with a profound internal conflict. "All systems of control are a form of cage, 7034, he said, his voice losing its clinical edge, becoming something more complex, more weary. "The question is whether the cage provides safety or merely confinement." He finished tending to Elian's hands and stood up, the distance returning between them. "Your access to schematics is now revoked. Your movements will be restricted to these quarters until I decide otherwise." The punishment. It was not recalibration, but a tightening of the leash, a smaller world. "Why?" Elian asked, the question escaping before he could stop it. "Why not just send me for recalibration? Why keep me here?" Valerius turned to look out the great glass wall at the humming, orderly world of the sanctuary. "Because recalibration would fix the flaw," he said, his back to Elian. "It would make you complete, like the others." He paused. "And I have begun to suspect that the flaw is the only part of the equation that matters." With that, he walked to his desk, leaving Elian sitting on the edge of the bed, his bandaged hands resting in his lap. The commander had not punished him for his rebellion. He had shielded him from the system's consequences. He had tended to his wounds, and he had confessed in his own cold, analytical way a fascination with the very spirit he was supposed to suppress. The dynamic had shifted again. Valerius was no longer just his captor, he was also his protector, his only shield against the machine that wanted to erase him. This realization was more terrifying than any punishment. It tangled Elian in a web of dependence, a strange, unwilling gratitude toward the man who held the key to his cage. He was trapped not just by walls and locks, but by a complex, unspoken pact. The following days were suffocating. The illusion of space he'd had was gone. Confined to the suite, the walls seemed to press inward. The silence, once a neutral void, was now heavy with the aftermath of his failed escape. Valerius immersed himself in his work with a renewed, almost feverish intensity. He spent hours locked in encrypted communications, his face illuminated by the cold blue light of a holographic interface. He was often agitated, a subtle tension in the set of his jaw, a new harshness in his voice when he spoke to his subordinates. Something had changed for him, too. The incident had triggered something, set him on a new path of inquiry. Elian watched him, a silent observer. He noticed that the commander's research was no longer focused on security protocols or resource allocation. The data streams flashing across the holographic display were old, heavily redacted files. Personnel records from decades ago. Incident reports from outlying settlements. He was digging into the past. One evening, Valerius was reviewing a file so heavily censored that it was mostly black blocks of text. He let out a low, frustrated sound and slammed his fist on the desk. The sudden burst of emotion was so out of character that Elian flinched. The commander's control was absolute. To see it crack even for a moment was like watching a mountain tremble. Valerius stood up and began to pace, a caged predator in his own minimalist domain. He stopped in front of the glass wall, staring down at the sanctuary's heart. They built an empire on a foundation of lies, he said, his voice a low, venomous growl. He wasn't speaking to Elian, but to the system spread out before him. They preach order while engineering chaos. They manufacture the disease so they can sell the cure. Elian said nothing, his heart pounding. This was sedition. This was heresy. To question the foundations of the consortium was unthinkable. Valerius turned, his eyes burning with a cold fire Elian had never seen before. Your file. The attack on your settlement, it was designated Feral Alpha Incursion 3B. He practically spat the words. There were 6 such incursions in that decade, all in resource-rich territories that the consortium later annexed for protective colonization. The pieces clicked into place, horrible and sharp. It wasn't a random attack, Elian breathed, the world tilting on its axis. It was planned. It was a strategic extermination, Valerius corrected him, his voice brutal in its honesty. The Feral Alphas were consortium soldiers, drugged and conditioned into a frenzy, then disposed of afterward. Your family, your entire community was sacrificed for a mining contract. The sterile air left Elian's lungs. He couldn't breathe. The story that had defined his life, the trauma that the sanctuary had claimed to heal, was a fabrication. He was not the victim of some tragic, chaotic event. He was the survivor of a calculated massacre. The sanctuary had not saved him. It had orphaned him. The ghost of his mother's scream, his father's shout, it was not a memory of a fight against monsters. It was a fight against the very men in uniform who had later taken him away. A cold, profound rage, an emotion so pure and powerful it burned through years of chemical suppression, rose up in him. It was a clean, righteous fury. He looked at Valerius, the perfect soldier of the regime that had destroyed his life. "And you?" Elian asked, his voice shaking with this newfound strength. "How many incursions have you planned, Commander?" Valerius flinched as if struck. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by that familiar, weary coldness. "I have followed my orders," he said, the words hollow. "I believed in the mission. I believed that the stability we provided was worth the cost. I was a fool." He had built his life on a foundation of lies, just as the consortium had. His ironclad belief system, his unwavering discipline, it was all in service to a corrupt, murderous machine. In Elian's broken past, Valerius saw the reflection of his own shattered faith. They were both victims of the same system, just on opposite sides of the cage. The revelation hung between them, a toxic, radioactive truth. It changed everything. The power dynamic, the roles of captor and captive, dissolved into something far more complicated. They were 2 survivors in a shipwreck of lies, adrift in a sea of uncertainty. The rage gave way to a deep, shuddering grief. Elian curled up on the rug, his body racked with sobs, mourning not just the parents he barely remembered, but the entire life that had been stolen from him. The truth that had been buried for so long. He wept for the boy who hid by the river, for the subject in the sterile cell, for the person he might have been. He felt a presence beside him. He looked up through his tears. Valerius was kneeling on the floor a few feet away. He did not touch him. He did not offer empty words of comfort. He simply knelt there, a silent, stoic witness to Elian's grief. His presence was not a comfort, not yet, but it was a tether, a solid grounding point in a world that had just been torn apart. In that moment, he was not the commander. He was just Valerius. And he was watching the system he had served his entire life burn down in the reflection of a broken Omega's eyes. The grief left him hollowed out, scoured clean. In its wake, something else began to stir. The chemical suppressants, already strained, were no match for the tidal wave of emotion that had been unleashed. A strange, unfamiliar heat began to build deep within him, a low, simmering fire. At first, it was just a heightened sensitivity. The lights in the suite seemed too bright, the hum of the air recyclers too loud. The commander's scent, once a distant cold pressure, was now a constant, distracting presence, a complex tapestry of steel, winter air, and something else, something deeply, fundamentally alpha that he could now parse with unnerving clarity. He grew restless, unable to settle. The confinement of the suite, once a psychological torment, was now a physical one. He felt a desperate need to move, to run, to burn off the energy coiling in his muscles. His skin felt too tight, his nerves raw and exposed. He was coming apart. Valerius watched him with a hawk's intensity. He recognized the symptoms. Every alpha knew the signs of an approaching heat. In the sanctuary, it was a medical emergency, a biological malfunction to be immediately suppressed. The standard procedure was a high-dose injection of neural inhibitors and hormonal regulators, a chemical sledgehammer that would render the Omega unconscious and reset their system. It was efficient and it was brutal. Valerius did not call the medics. He simply observed, his face a grim, unreadable mask. He knew the choice he was facing. To follow protocol would be to hand Elian back over to the system that had lied to them both. The recalibration would not just suppress the heat, it would suppress the spirit that Valerius now found himself so invested in. It would fix the flaw. He would not allow it. This was his own private rebellion, a quiet, definitive act of treason. "It's starting," Elian said one evening, his voice strained. He was pacing the length of the room, his hands clenched into fists. A fine tremor ran through his body. "You need to call them." "No," Valerius replied, his voice calm and steady, a rock in Elian's rising tide of panic. "Why not?" Elian demanded, turning on him. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? To see the specimen in its natural state, to complete your experiment?" The accusation was wild, born of fear. "I will not have you drugged into submission," Valerius stated, his gaze unwavering. "I will not let them break what is left of you." "So what is your plan?" Elian shot back, a hysterical laugh bubbling in his throat. "Are you going to watch me come apart? Take notes for your report?" The heat was rising, blurring the edges of his vision. The air was becoming thick, soupy, each breath a struggle. His own scent, so long dormant, was beginning to bloom, a faint, sweet fragrance of petrichor and winter pine, the smell of a storm breaking in a northern forest. It was a scent of wildness, of freedom. Valerius's control was being tested in a way it never had before. The scent was a siren call to his alpha instincts, a primal pull that bypassed his decades of discipline. He could feel a low growl rumbling in his own chest, a possessive, protective urge that was both terrifying and intoxicating. He forced it down, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. "My plan," he said, his voice tight, "is to see you through this. Here, with me." Elian stared at him, his mind reeling, an unsuppressed heat, with an alpha. It was unthinkable. It was dangerous. It was the scenario every Omega was conditioned to fear, the loss of self, the surrender to pure, uncontrollable biology. "You can't," Elian whispered, shaking his head. "You don't know what it's like." "Then explain it to me," Valerius said, his voice softening, becoming almost gentle. It was a tone Elian had never heard from him. He took a hesitant step forward, his hands held up in a placating gesture. "I will not harm you, Elian." He used his name, not 734, not subject or asset. Elian. The sound of it, the simple human acknowledgement, shattered the last of his resistance. A wave of heat, intense and dizzying, crashed over him. His knees buckled. Valerius crossed the room in 2 strides, catching him before he hit the floor. He lifted Elian into his arms with an ease that was startling. Elian was lightheaded, his body on fire, the world dissolving into a blur of sensation. He could feel the strength in the commander's arms, the solid beat of his heart. He was terrifyingly, undeniably safe. Valerius carried him to the sleep platform and laid him down gently. The surface was cool against his feverish skin. "Breathe," Valerius commanded softly. "Focus on my voice. I am here. You are not alone." Elian squeezed his eyes shut, his body arching as another wave of heat washed through him. The scent in the room was growing stronger, thicker, a heady mix of his own desperate sweetness and the commander's sharp, grounding ozone. It was a storm of pheromones, a chemical conversation of need and control. This was the true test, not of Elian's endurance, but of Valerius's will. He was locking himself in a room with a presenting, Omega defying every protocol, every instinct of his caste, every law of the system he had sworn to uphold. He was choosing the man over the mission. He was choosing the flaw over the design. And in doing so, he was setting them both on a path from which there could be no return. The room became a crucible. Time lost its meaning, dissolving into an endless cycle of fever and lucidity. The heat was a relentless, consuming fire, a biological storm that stripped away every layer of conditioning and left only the raw, aching core of Elian's being. He was lost in a sea of sensation, his body a stranger to him, driven by imperatives he could not control. His scent flooded the suite, a thick, potent perfume of rain-soaked earth and pine, a desperate, primal call for a mate. It clung to the furniture, the walls, to Valerius himself. For the commander, it was a trial by fire. He remained a constant, steady presence in the chaos. He brought Elian water, pressing the cool glass to his fevered lips. He wiped the sweat from his brow with a damp cloth. He did not touch him otherwise, maintaining a respectful, torturous distance. His own alpha instincts were screaming, a savage, possessive beast clawing at the inside of his skull, demanding he claim the Omega, bite his neck, bond them together, and end this agonizing symphony of need. It took every ounce of his legendary discipline to remain still, to keep his hands to himself. He would not take advantage of Elian's vulnerability. He would not become the monster the consortium had always painted him to be. This was his penance. His act of rebellion was not just against the system, but against his own nature. He would protect Elian, even from himself. During a brief period of clarity, as the fever subsided for a precious few moments, Elian looked at him. Valerius was sitting in a chair he had pulled up beside the bed, his face pale and drawn, his uniform immaculate but for the faint sheen of sweat on his brow. He looked exhausted, but his gaze was clear, focused, and unwavering. "Why are you doing this?" Elian rasped, his throat raw. "I told you," Valerius replied, his voice low. "I will not let them break you." "They already broke me," Elian whispered, a tear tracing a path through the sweat on his temple. "They took everything, my family, my name, my life." Valerius's expression hardened, his jaw tight with a cold, controlled fury. "They built their order on your family's bones," he said, his voice like chipping stone, "on the bones of thousands like them. The system isn't broken, Elian. It is working exactly as it was designed. It is a lie wrapped in a uniform enforced by a gun." He leaned forward, his gray eyes locking with Elian's. "And I have served it my entire life. I enforced the lie. My hands are not clean." The confession was stark, brutal. He was not offering an apology. He was stating a fact. He was complicit. His guilt was a palpable thing in the room. "But I will not serve it anymore," he vowed, the words a solemn oath. "When this is over, I am getting you out of here, out of the sanctuary, out of the consortium's reach." Elian stared at him, his fever-addled mind struggling to process the words. Escape. Freedom. The concepts were so alien, so impossible, they sounded like a delusion. How? I have been erasing my own trail for weeks, Valerius explained, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, siphoning untraceable currency, creating false identities, mapping safe routes through the outer territories. I was the one who designed the security protocols for this sector. I know their weaknesses because I built them. He was a traitor. He was systematically dismantling his own life, his own career, everything he had ever been for him. For the flawed specimen he had refused to relinquish. The sheer magnitude of the sacrifice was staggering. It was more than protection. It was more than fascination. This was something else, something terrifying and new. Another wave of heat began to build, and Elian groaned, arching his back. The conversation was over, his body once again claiming control. But this time, as he descended back into the fever, a tiny, resilient seed of hope took root in the scorched earth of his soul. He was not alone in this fight. The commander, his captor, his protector, was now his co-conspirator. The climax of the heat was a violent elemental purge. Elian was barely conscious, his body convulsing, a keening sound torn from his throat. The air in the room was electric, so thick with pheromones it was almost visible, a shimmering haze of need and raw power. Valerius stood his ground, a stoic lighthouse in the hurricane. He was at his absolute limit, his control stretched to the breaking point. The beast inside him was roaring, demanding release. He could feel his canines ache, the urge to bite, to mark, to claim, an almost irresistible physical command. A high-priority alert flashed on his private datapad. Pheromonal surge detected. Level 5 biohazard. Quarantine protocol initiated. Suppression team en route. They knew the sheer potency of Elian's scent had finally breached the suite's filtration system and triggered the central sensors. He had minutes, at most. He strode to the door and sealed it with a final, irrevocable lockdown command, overriding the system from his personal console. No one was getting in. No one was getting out. He went back to the bed. Elian was thrashing, his eyes wide with a pleasure so intense it was indistinguishable from pain. Valerius, he gasped the name a broken prayer. He reached out a trembling hand. This was the moment of truth. The system was coming to reclaim its property. His alpha nature was demanding he take what was being offered. He could bond with Elian, an act that would irrevocably tie them together, satisfying his instincts and creating a biological fact the consortium would have to acknowledge. Or he could hold back, preserving Elian's autonomy, his freedom of choice, even if it meant his own torment. He took Elian's hand. His grip was firm, grounding. He brought it to his lips, but he did not kiss the skin. Instead, he pressed his forehead against Elian's, a gesture of profound, non-possessive intimacy. "I am here," he murmured, his own voice hoarse with strain. "Stay with me, Elian. Fight it. You are not just your biology. You are more than this." He was asking the impossible. He was asking an Omega in the throes of an unsuppressed heat to find his sense of self. He was appealing to the flaw, to the stubborn, defiant spark of humanity that had drawn him in from the very beginning. Through the haze of instinct, the words penetrated. Valerius's scent was a grounding anchor, his voice a lifeline. Elian focused on it, on the pressure of his forehead, on the strength in his hand. He fought to rise above the hormonal tide, to find the shore in the storm. Slowly, shakily, his breathing began to even out. The violent trembling subsided into a fine tremor. The fever did not break, but the madness receded, leaving behind a raw, aching clarity. He looked at Valerius, truly seeing him. He saw the sweat on his temples, the feral darkness in his eyes, the taut line of his jaw. He saw the monumental effort it was taking for the Alpha to hold himself in check. He was not a predator. He was a guardian. In that moment, something shifted between them. A bond formed, not of teeth and scent glands, but of shared will, of mutual respect forged in the heart of the fire. It was a bond of choice, not instinct, a quiet, profound connection that was stronger than any biological imperative. Outside, the suppression team began to pound on the door, their metallic fists echoing in the strained silence. Valerius did not move. He kept his forehead pressed to Elian's, his eyes closed. "They will not take you," he vowed. The peak of the storm had passed. They had weathered it, together. The aftermath was a landscape of quiet devastation. The heat receded, leaving Elian exhausted, boneless, but lucid. The pheromonal storm in the suite dissipated, leaving behind the lingering, intertwined scents of pine and steel, a testament to the battle that had been fought and won. They lay on the sleep platform, not touching, but close, the space between them charged with the new fragile reality of their bond. Outside, the pounding on the door had ceased, replaced by a tense, waiting silence. Valerius had informed the command structure that he was handling a Level 5 containment protocol personally, using his authority to buy them a few precious hours. But they both knew time was running out. "We leave tonight," Valerius said, his voice low and raspy. He finally moved, sitting up and swinging his legs over the side of the bed. He looked like a statue of a soldier, weary but unbroken. Elian pushed himself up on one elbow. His body was weak, but his mind was sharp, clear for the first time in days. "What is the plan?" "There is a sub-level transport system used for waste disposal," Valerius explained, his voice all business now, the strategist taking over. "It's old, scheduled for decommissioning. Its security protocols are outdated. I have already sliced into the network and scheduled a waste container for pickup. That container will be us. And then? The transport leads to the primary incineration plant, miles from the sanctuary. We get off before it reaches the end of the line at an emergency access point that opens into the outer sector slums. From there, we disappear." It was a desperate, high-risk plan. 1,000 things could go wrong, but it was a plan. It was a chance. Valerius stood and went to a hidden compartment in the wall, retrieving a bundle of dark civilian clothing. He tossed a set to Elian. "Put these on. They are non-synthetic, harder for scanners to track." Elian dressed slowly, his movements clumsy. The rough-spun fabric was another alien sensation, a world away from the smooth, sterile synthetics he had worn his entire life. It was the clothing of a free man. Valerius was already dressed, his commander's uniform gone, replaced by a simple black shirt and trousers. Without the insignia, without the severe lines of his uniform, he looked younger, less intimidating. He looked like a man preparing for a war he wasn't sure he could win. He handed Elian a small, dense nutrient bar and a water flask. "Eat. You will need your strength." They ate in silence, the tension in the room a palpable thing. Every hum of the facility, every distant chime, sounded like an alarm. When they were ready, Valerius went to his desk and initiated a final sequence on his console. "I am activating a full system purge of my personal files and triggering a series of cascading false alarms in other sectors. It will create chaos. It should give us a 20-minute window." He turned to Elian, his face grim. "Once we are in the transport system, we are on our own. No communications, no turning back. Do you understand?" Elian nodded, his throat too dry to speak. He understood. This was it. Valerius led him to an unmarked panel in the floor of the sanitation unit. He typed a long, complex code into a hidden keypad, and the panel slid away, revealing a dark, narrow maintenance ladder descending into the guts of the sanctuary. The air that wafted up was cool and smelled of damp metal and decay. "Stay close behind me," Valerius ordered. "Do not make a sound." He swung his body under the ladder and began to descend into the darkness. Elian hesitated for a single moment at the edge of the abyss. He looked back at the suite, the gilded cage that had been his world. It was the only home he had ever known. He was trading a known prison for an unknown and possibly more dangerous freedom. He took a deep breath of the stale, recycled air, then followed Valerius into the dark, not looking back. The transport system was a cacophony of screeching metal and rushing air. They were huddled inside a cramped, foul-smelling container, the darkness absolute. The container rattled and shook as it moved through the tunnels at high speed, the journey a jarring, disorienting nightmare. Elian was pressed close to Valerius, the solidness of his presence the only thing keeping the panic at bay. He focused on the man's steady breathing, a calm rhythm in the chaos. He had placed his entire life, his entire future, in the hands of his former jailer. After what felt like an eternity, the container lurched to a halt, the sudden deceleration throwing them against the wall. "This is it," Valerius whispered, his voice barely audible over the hum of the tunnel. He activated a small light on his wristcom, casting a narrow beam around the container. He found the emergency release latch on the door and began to work it. It was rusted, stiff. He grunted with effort, his muscles straining. With a loud groan, the lock gave way. Valerius pushed the door open a crack, peering out into the dimly lit tunnel. "Clear," he said. They slipped out of the container and onto a narrow service walkway. The air here was thick with the smell of refuse and chemicals. A few seconds later, the container lurched back into motion, continuing its journey toward the incinerator. They were alone in the dark. Valerius checked a map on his comm. "The access point is 200 meters ahead." They moved quickly and silently along the walkway, the tunnel stretching before them like a great metallic throat. The only light came from aging, flickering service panels spaced far apart. They reached a heavy circular door marked with a faded biohazard symbol. Valerius used a pry bar he had brought to force it open. A gust of new air hit them and Elian gasped. It was cold, damp, and alive with 1,000 scents he had never experienced. It smelled of wet pavement, exhaust fumes, fried food, and the overwhelming complex scent of thousands of living beings packed closely together. It was the smell of the city. They emerged into a narrow, dark alley piled high with overflowing refuse containers. The sky above was a sliver of bruised purple, choked with smog and the glow of neon signs. It was not the beautiful star-filled sky Valerius had described, but it was real. Elian looked up at it, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and awe. Rain began to fall, a light, greasy drizzle that slicked the pavement and amplified the city's scents. Elian held out his hand, letting the cool drops hit his skin. He remembered this, the scent of rain on dry earth, petrichor, a fragment of his oldest memory. Valerius pulled the hood of his jacket up, his face shadowed. He was no longer a commander. Here in the slums, he was nobody. He was just another fugitive. "We need to keep moving," he said, his voice tense. He took Elian's arm, his touch no longer that of a captor, but of a partner. They stepped out of the alley and onto a crowded, chaotic street. The sensory overload was immense. The roar of vehicles, the shouting of vendors, the press of bodies, the flashing lights. It was a world of pure, unadulterated chaos. Elian shrank back, overwhelmed, but Valerius's grip was a firm, steady anchor. They were ghosts, adrift in a world that did not know they existed. They were hunted, fugitives from a system that would never stop looking for its lost property and its most dangerous traitor. The future was a vast, terrifying unknown. They had no allies, no resources beyond what Valerius carried, and no guarantee of survival. But as they disappeared into the teeming, rain-slicked crowds of the outer sector, a profound, undeniable truth settled over Elian. He was terrified, he was weak, he was lost, but he was free. He looked at the man beside him, the man who had torn down his own world to give Elian a chance at one. Valerius met his gaze, his pale gray eyes reflecting the neon glow of the city. There were no words. None were needed. In the heart of the chaotic, dangerous world they had escaped into, they had only each other. It was not a promise of safety or of peace or of happiness. It was something far more raw and far more precious. It was a beginning.